Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the cold, rattling world of a coaching inn on the Great North Road, that muddy, rutted lifeline connecting London to Edinburgh in the 1700s. Picture yourself crammed into a stagecoach that smells like wet wool, unwashed humanity, and someone's questionable meat pie, bouncing over roads that make modern potholes look like gentle massage therapy. You've been travelling for 8 brutal hours. Your spine feels like it's been tenderised with a mallet, and you're starting to genuinely question whether you'll reach your destination or simply disintegrate into component parts somewhere near Stevenage. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing the global bedtime crew checking in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The November twilight is thickening into proper darkness when you first spot them, twin lanterns glowing amber through the mist about a quarter-mile ahead. Your fellow passengers stir from their stupor of misery, craning necks toward the windows, because those lights mean salvation, the Red Lion, the Golden Fleece, the King's Arms, whatever this particular coaching inn calls itself. Right now it might as well be the gates of paradise, promising hot food, strong ale, and the blessed cessation of movement. The coachman up top cracks his whip with theatrical flair. He knows he's approaching an audience, and the 4 horses lean into their collars with renewed energy. Even they can smell the stables. You feel the coach accelerate slightly, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding over packed earth and gravel as it swings off the main road into the inn-yard. Through the grimy window glass you catch fragmentary impressions. A sprawling half-timbered building, multiple chimneys streaming wood smoke, shadowy figures moving with purpose in the lantern light. The coach lurches to a stop with a final bone-jarring thud, and you hear the guard dismount from his perch at the rear, his boots hitting the ground with a satisfying thunk. The door swings open, admitting a blast of November air that somehow feels refreshing after 8 hours of enclosed humanity. "Red Lion, Barnet," the guard announces as if any of you had forgotten your destination. 20 minutes for supper, fresh horses, then northward. You climb down the narrow steps with all the grace of a newborn giraffe, your legs having apparently forgotten their primary function during the journey. The inn-yard spreads before you in organised chaos. Ostlers are already unhitching your exhausted team while fresh horses stamp and snort in their holding pen, their breath creating small clouds in the cold air. A wagon loaded with wool bales sits near the stable entrance, and somewhere a dog barks with aggressive enthusiasm at absolutely nothing. The main building looms 3 stories tall, its windows glowing with candlelight and promising warmth. You can hear the din from the common room already. Laughter, arguments, the scrape of benches, a fiddle attempting something vaguely musical. The inn's painted sign creaks on its chains overhead, a magnificently improbable red lion rampant, looking far more regal than any establishment specialising in questionable stew and flea-ridden mattresses has any right to claim. Historians still argue whether these coaching inns were genuine havens of hospitality or simply highly efficient machines for extracting maximum coin from desperate travellers. Tonight, you're too cold and hungry to care about academic debates. An ostler, maybe 16 years old, wearing a leather apron that's seen better decades, grabs your small trunk from the coach's boot. "Staying the night, sir?" he asks, already calculating his tip. You nod, and he gestures toward the main entrance with his chin. "Landlord's just inside. Best speak to him quick before the Edinburgh stage arrives. They're running only 30 minutes behind, and they'll fill every bed." You join the shuffling queue of your fellow passengers heading toward the door, everyone moving with that particular stiffness that comes from prolonged coach travel. The woman who spent the entire journey complaining about her daughter-in-law's cooking waddles ahead of you. Behind you, the merchant who wouldn't stop discussing his revolutionary new method for waterproofing leather clears his throat importantly, preparing to lecture the innkeeper about proper business practices. The doorway exhales warmth and noise and the complex aroma of wood smoke, cooking meat, spilled ale, unwashed bodies, and tallow candles. It's not pleasant exactly, but it smells like civilization after the raw cold of the road. You step across the threshold into the Red Lion's common room, and the sensory assault intensifies. The roar of conversation, the heat from 2 massive fireplaces, the visual chaos of perhaps 40 people all competing for space, service, and attention. Welcome to an 18th century coaching inn on the Great North Road, where comfort is relative, privacy is a fantasy, and you're about to spend the most memorably uncomfortable night of your journey. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some coaching inns kept a resurrection man on retainer, essentially a grave robber who could provide bodies to surgeons, since these establishments saw a steady stream of suspicious deaths and unclaimed corpses. Pleasant dreams. Your immediate mission is simple: secure food, drink, and a place to sleep that preferably doesn't involve sharing with livestock. Whether you'll succeed at any of these remains to be seen. The landlord materializes before you've taken 3 steps into the room, which is either impressive attentiveness or mildly supernatural. He's a solid man in his 50s, wearing a stained waistcoat that might once have been burgundy, and he's developed that particular publican's skill of assessing a person's financial worth in approximately 1.3 seconds. His eyes flick from your mud-splattered cloak to your leather travelling bag to your boots. Decent quality but showing wear, and you can practically see him performing mental calculations. "Good evening, traveller," he says, his tone professionally warm but non-committal. "Seeking accommodation for the night, or just changing horses?" His accent places him as local to Hertfordshire, with that particular vowel elongation that marks the region. Behind him, a harried-looking woman, presumably his wife, navigates through the crowd balancing 6 tankards with the skill of a circus performer. You confirm you need a room, and something shifts minutely in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a recognition that you're a potential revenue source worth cultivating. "Certainly, certainly. Now we have several options depending on your requirements and, circumstances." By circumstances he means your purse, and you both know it. The coaching inn landlord occupies a fascinating position in 18th century society, simultaneously a businessman, intelligence gatherer, banker, and informal magistrate. This man knows everyone who travels this road, reads every letter that passes through his hands. Postal services often operated from coaching inns, and could probably tell you which merchant is bankrupting himself with a mistress in York, and which nobleman's wife is conducting an affair with her dancing master. He's also quite possibly the wealthiest man in this entire parish, because these establishments are gold mines when run competently. "Our finest chamber overlooks the yard," he continues, gesturing vaguely upward. "Private room, good bed, warming pan provided, fresh linens changed weekly." You note he said weekly, not daily, which gives you some sense of 18th century hospitality standards. 2 shillings 6pence for the night, including breakfast. That's roughly what a labourer might earn in 3 days, and your face must betray something because he smoothly transitions. Of course, if that's a bit steep, we have very comfortable shared accommodations. 6pence gets you a bed. Well, half a bed technically, as you'd be sharing with one other gentleman of respectable character. Historians still argue whether shared beds in coaching inns were the norm or the exception, with evidence suggesting it varied wildly by establishment quality and road traffic. Either way, the practice was common enough that etiquette guides actually included advice on proper bed-sharing conduct with strangers, which should tell you everything you need to know about the era's concept of personal space. A crash from the kitchen, breaking crockery by the sound of it, makes the landlord flinch slightly, but he maintains his professional composure. We also have spots in the common sleeping room upstairs for 3pence, though I'll be honest, it does get rather convivial. And for those watching their expenditure very carefully, there's always the stable loft at a penny, though you'd be among the ostlers and grooms. You're mentally calculating your remaining travel funds and trying to decide whether your dignity is worth 2 shillings, when a well-dressed gentleman pushes past you, practically radiating wealth from his silver-buckled shoes to his powdered wig. "Landlord, your best room immediately, and I'll require a private parlour for dining. I cannot possibly eat among—" He waves dismissively at the common room's chaos. "All this." The landlord's demeanour transforms instantly, becoming noticeably more obsequious. "Mr. Harrison, what a pleasure, sir. Yes, of course, the best chamber is available, and the private parlour naturally. Shall I have cook prepare the capon? We received a lovely fresh delivery this morning." You notice the price isn't mentioned. When you're that wealthy, discussing money is gauche. Mr. Harrison sweeps toward the stairs, accompanied by the landlord's elaborate bowing, leaving you standing there feeling approximately as important as the boot scraper. The landlord's wife appears at your elbow, having apparently inherited your custom. "Don't mind himself," she says quietly, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Every coaching inn on this road has its Mr. Harrison, thinks his merchant profits make him gentry. Now, what can we actually do for you, love?" You negotiate for the shared room at 6pence, figuring that half a bed with a stranger beats the stable loft's ambience of horse manure and frozen extremities. She nods approvingly, as if you've passed some kind of test in practical decision-making. Wise choice. Your bedmate tonight is a clerk heading north on law business. Quiet fellow, doesn't snore too terribly. Well, not louder than a sawmill anyway. She produces a leather-bound ledger from somewhere in her apron and dips a quill in ink. Name? You provide it, and she records your details in surprisingly elegant handwriting. You'll be in the blue room, 2nd floor, 3rd door on the left. Here's your token. She hands you a small wooden disc with a number carved into it. Show this when you want breakfast. We serve from 6 o'clock, and if you're not down by 7, you miss it. We don't coddle late sleepers here. A quirky tidbit for you. Coaching Inn landlords often functioned as informal bankers, holding valuables in their strongboxes and even extending credit to known travellers. Some issued their own promissory notes that could be redeemed at other inns along the route, essentially an early form of travellers' cheques, except enforced by reputation and the very real threat of being blacklisted from the entire coaching network. Supper's being served now in the common room, the landlady continues. Mutton stew tonight, or there's a meat pie if you prefer something more portable. Either one comes with bread and small beer. Ale costs extra, as does wine, though I'll warn you our wine is mostly suited to those who've already had enough ale not to notice quality. You thank the landlady and turn to face the common room properly, steel yourself mentally, and plunge into the chaos like a swimmer entering cold water, best done quickly and without overthinking. The room is perhaps 40 feet long and 20 wide, with massive oak beams overhead darkened by decades of smoke to the colour of old leather. 2 fireplaces, one at each end, roar with logs that must be 2 feet across, and yet somehow the heat doesn't quite reach the middle of the room where you're standing. The walls are whitewashed plaster, decorated with coaching horns, old horse brasses, and a collection of framed prints showing hunting scenes that probably looked fashionable 30 years ago. Every available surface hosts human bodies in various states of exhaustion and inebriation. The long trestle tables running down the centre are packed shoulder to shoulder with travellers, while smaller tables near the walls accommodate those willing to pay extra for the illusion of privacy. Benches scrape against flagstone floors as people shuffle to make room or leave to relieve themselves in the yard. The noise level resembles what you'd get if you locked 40 people in a barrel and rolled it downhill, everyone talking at maximum volume to be heard over everyone else talking at maximum volume. The air is thick enough to chew. Pipe smoke hangs in lazy blue-grey clouds near the ceiling, occasionally stirred by draughts from the door or the chimneys. You can identify at least 6 different tobacco blends by smell, plus the sharper tang of snuff, the yeasty warmth of spilled ale, the grease smoke from the kitchen, and the fundamental aroma of damp wool and unwashed humanity. In summer, this place must be absolutely apocalyptic. In November, it's merely medieval. You navigate toward an open spot at one of the central tables, squeezing between a woman nursing a sleeping infant and a red-faced man who appears to be 3 ales past coherent speech. "Careful there, friend," he slurs cheerfully, gesturing with a tankard and sloshing beer onto the already sticky table. "This bench has a bad leg. Throws you right onto your arse if you sit too far left. Learned that the expensive way." He dissolves into laughter at his own wit. Across from you, a middle-aged couple argues in intense whispers about whether they should have taken the coastal route instead. Next to them, 3 young men, apprentices by their dress, are playing cards with the focused intensity of people gambling their last pennies. A few seats down, an elderly woman knits with mechanical precision, while completely ignoring the pandemonium around her, which is honestly the most impressive feat of concentration you've witnessed all week. The conversational topics swirl and collide like debris in a flood. To your left, 2 merchants are debating the reliability of Scottish banks. To your right, a farmer describes in excruciating detail every symptom of his horse's lameness. Behind you, someone is explaining their theory about why the French are plotting something sinister, which, given that England and France are in one of their periodic wars, isn't exactly groundbreaking political analysis. 23 hours from London, a voice bellows from near the far fireplace. 23 hours, and we only stopped 4 times. That's a record, I tell you. A small crowd has gathered around what appears to be a coach guard regaling them with tales of exceptional speed and daring. Coaching times were sources of intense pride and competition. The ability to shave an hour off the London to Edinburgh journey could make an inn's reputation and fortune. Historians still argue whether the famous coach speed records of the 18th century were genuine achievements or embellished marketing propaganda, with some documented record times being physically impossible given road conditions, horse capabilities, and the basic laws of physics, but never let facts interfere with a good tavern story. A serving maid materializes at your elbow with the supernatural timing they all seem to possess. She's perhaps 20, wearing a stained apron over a simple brown dress, her hair tucked under a cap that's slipping loose on one side. "What'll you have?" she shouts directly into your ear, the only way to be heard. "Mutton stew and ale," you shout back, already feeling your voice strain. This is not an environment conducive to restful evening conversation. She nods, holds up 2 fingers to confirm your order to someone in the kitchen you can't see, and vanishes into the crowd with practiced efficiency. The card game to your right has escalated into an accusation of cheating, though good-natured enough that actual violence seems unlikely. "I saw you palm that king, you bastard," one apprentice laughs. "I've been watching your hands like a jealous wife." His companions roar approval at the comparison, slapping the table hard enough to make the candles jump. Near the fireplace, someone has produced a fiddle and is attempting to play what might be a popular tune, or might be the sound of a cat being strangled. Hard to tell with the acoustics. A few people attempt to sing along, creating a cacophony that would make angels weep. You're starting to understand why the wealthy Mr. Harrison insisted on a private parlour. 2 shillings for silence suddenly seems like a reasonable investment. A man in clerical dress, collar marking him as Church of England, sits alone at a corner table, reading what appears to be a Bible by candlelight, while mechanically spooning stew into his mouth. The fact that he can concentrate on scripture in this environment suggests either deep piety or early-stage deafness, possibly both. Here's a quirky tidbit. Coaching inns employed professional boots, servants whose entire job was cleaning and maintaining, travellers' footwear overnight. The position was so standard that boots became a common nickname, and these individuals often functioned as the inn's informal intelligence network, learning secrets from the mud patterns and wear on customers' shoes. Your boots, for instance, would tell a skilled practitioner exactly how many miles you'd walk today, and on what type of terrain. The door crashes open again, admitting another wave of cold air and passengers from a southbound coach. The noise level somehow increases, which you wouldn't have thought possible. You're beginning to suspect that sleep tonight will require either substantial quantities of ale or a complete surrender to chaos. Your stew is coming, your ale is coming. Your bed, half of it anyway, awaits upstairs. For now, you're just another anonymous traveller in the Red Lion's nightly circus, and honestly, there's something almost comforting about being one small voice in this enormous, smoky, chaotic chorus of people all going somewhere they'd rather be. The serving maid reappears with impressive speed, sliding a wooden trencher in front of you with the practiced efficiency of someone who's done this approximately 10,000 times. The stew sloshes slightly, releasing a cloud of steam that carries the aroma of, well, meat of some description. Onions, root vegetables, and the unmistakable scent of lard. Lots of lard. Next to the trencher, she plants a wooden tankard of ale that's already sloshing foam over its rim, and a hunk of dark bread that could probably double as a defensive weapon. "That'll be 5p total," she announces, palm already extended. You fish out the coins while studying your meal with the cautious optimism of someone who's learned that mutton stew is often more aspiration than accurate description. The stew itself is a murky brown liquid studded with chunks of meat, potato, turnip, and what might be carrot if you're feeling generous. The meat pieces vary wildly in size and texture. Some are stringy, some are fatty, and at least one piece has a suspicious amount of gristle. You pick up your wooden spoon, no forks for common travellers, those are luxuries for the private parlours, and prod experimentally at a larger chunk. Is it mutton? Could be. Might also be old goat, elderly horse, optimistic rat, or that pig that died under mysterious circumstances last Tuesday. Coaching in cooks operated under the philosophical principle that sufficient onions and cooking time could render literally anything edible, and they weren't entirely wrong. The meat has been stewed long enough that its original identity has become more theoretical than factual. You take a tentative bite. It's not terrible? The flavour is aggressively onion-forward, with undertones of pepper and something that might be thyme if the cook remembered herbs that day. The meat has the texture of leather that's been boiled into submission, but it's hot, it's filling, and after 8 hours of coach travel your standards have adjusted accordingly. You're not going to ask questions. Questions lead to answers you definitely don't want while eating. The bread is another adventure entirely. It's dark, dense, and composed of flour that probably includes a percentage of husks, chaff, and whatever else was swept off the mill floor. The crust could deflect small-caliber projectiles, but you dunk it in the stew, let it soften slightly, and actually, yes, this works. The bread soaks up the greasy broth and becomes something approaching palatable. Your ale, at least, is reliably mediocre. Small beer, weak enough that you could drink it all day without falling over, which is exactly the point since the water around here would probably kill you faster than the mystery meat. It's slightly sour, vaguely yeasty, and marginally cold from being stored in the cellar. Perfect. Around you, your fellow diners attack their meals with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The red-faced drunk has graduated to the meat pie, which he's eating, with his hands like a medieval peasant, grease running down his chin. The knitting woman continues to knit with one hand while spooning stew with the other. Truly impressive multitasking. The merchants have paused their banking discussion to focus on eating, with the grim determination of men who know this is the only meal they'll see until tomorrow. Here's a mainstream historical fact for you. Coaching inns typically serve just 2 meals daily, dinner in the early afternoon and supper in the evening. Breakfast was bread, butter and cold meat, available only to overnight guests. The kitchen operated on a fixed schedule, and if you arrived outside mealtimes, you could pay extra for special preparation, or simply go hungry. The phrase, keeping in hours, referred to this rigid dining schedule, which governed the rhythm of travel on Britain's roads. The clerical gentleman at his corner table has finished eating and now sits with his hands folded, apparently praying or possibly just recovering from the meal. Hard to tell. You notice he's left a small pile of gristle on the edge of his trencher, the only inedible parts, which gives you some sense of what theological scholars consider beyond redemption. First time on the North Road? The question comes from the man next to you, a weathered individual in his 40s wearing the practical clothes of a tradesman. He's noticed you examining your stew with perhaps excessive caution. That obvious, you reply. He grins. You're still trying to identify the meat. Old hands just eat it and thank God it's cooked. I've been travelling this route twice monthly for 15 years, York to London and back, and I can tell you the Red Lion stew is positively gourmet compared to some establishments. There's an inn near Grantham where the cook apparently believes that stew means boil water and hope for the best. Historians still argue whether coaching in food was genuinely awful or simply utilitarian, with some arguing that modern critics apply unfair standards to establishments feeding hundreds of people daily with 18th century preservation technology and limited ingredients. The truth probably lies somewhere between aggressively mediocre and surprisingly competent given the constraints. Your new companion introduces himself as William, a cloth merchant travelling to Edinburgh for business. Word of advice, he continues, lowering his voice slightly. Eat everything they give you, even if it's questionable. You never know when the next meal's coming, especially if weather turns bad or a wheel breaks. I once spent 14 hours stranded near Doncaster, surviving on stale biscuits and regret. You file this wisdom away and apply yourself more seriously to your stew, abandoning any pretense of selective eating. William's right. This is fuel, not fine dining. The potato chunks are mealy but filling. The turnips have the structural integrity of wet paper but add bulk. The mystery meat provides protein of some description. Together they form a meal that will keep you alive and functional, which is really all you can ask from a coaching inn supper costing 5p. A quirky tidbit for your consideration. Some coaching inns kept a perpetual stew pot simmering constantly in the kitchen, with new ingredients added daily and nothing ever fully discarded. The oldest documented perpetual stew allegedly ran for 7 years before the pot finally cracked, meaning some travellers in 1755 might have been eating traces of mutton from 1748. Food safety regulations were flexible. You drain your ale and use the last of your bread to mop up the remaining broth from your trencher. Your stomach feels full, not satisfied exactly, but full, which is genuinely all you are hoping for. With your immediate hunger addressed, you can now focus on the more anthropological aspects of coaching in life, namely, studying your fellow travellers with the detached curiosity of someone watching a particularly chaotic stage play. William the cloth merchant has turned his attention to a ledger he's produced from his coat, squinting at numbers by candlelight and occasionally muttering about profit margins. But the rest of the table offers far more interesting specimens. Directly across from you sits a gentleman who arrived on the same coach, though he's managed to secure slightly more personal space through sheer force of personality. He's perhaps 50, wearing a bottle green coat with brass buttons and an elaborate waistcoat that screams, "I have money and want you to know it." His wig is freshly powdered, somehow still pristine despite the journey, and he's holding his tankard with his pinky extended like he's taking tea with the Archbishop of Canterbury. The problem with Scottish trade, he announces to no one in particular, which is how you know he's the type who considers every thought a public address, is the fundamental lack of commercial sophistication north of the border. I've been conducting business in Edinburgh for 20 years, and I can assure you they simply don't understand proper mercantile practices. William glances up from his ledger with an expression suggesting he's heard this exact speech approximately 40 times before. Nobody else reacts, which only encourages the pompous merchant to continue. Take their banking system, for instance. Absolutely primitive. In London, we have established procedures, proper oversight, bills of exchange that are honoured throughout Europe. In Scotland, chaos. I once waited 3 weeks for a promissory note to clear because the banker claimed he needed to verify my character. My character? As if my word isn't worth more than all the Edinburgh goldsmiths' combined holdings. You're starting to understand why he's sitting alone despite the crowded conditions. There's an invisible bubble of irritation surrounding him that other travellers instinctively avoid. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Scottish banking in the 18th century was actually remarkably innovative, having introduced paper money, interest-bearing deposits, and cash credit accounts decades before England. The Bank of Scotland was founded in 1695, and by the 1750s Scottish banks were experimenting with financial instruments that wouldn't appear in London until the next century. So this gentleman is, to put it charitably, talking out of his impressively pompous posterior. To your left, the nervous clergyman from earlier has migrated closer, perhaps seeking refuge from the rowdier elements near the fireplace. He's a thin man, probably in his 30s, with the pale complexion of someone who spends most of his time indoors studying theological texts. His hands shake slightly as he lifts his ale, and his eyes dart around the room like a rabbit expecting foxes. "Terrible business on the roads these days," he murmurs, more to himself than anyone specific. Simply terrible. Did you hear about the coach attacked near Highgate last week? Highwaymen stopped them in broad daylight. Broad daylight? They say one of the robbers wore a velvet mask and quoted poetry while stealing a lady's jewellery. William snorts. Half those stories are invented by nervous parsons and excitable widows. I've been travelling this road for 15 years and never seen a highwayman. Plenty of toll collectors who might as well be highwaymen, but that's different. The clergyman looks personally affronted. "I assure you, sir, the dangers are quite real. My bishop specifically warned me about travelling after dark. He said the stretch between here and Stevenage is particularly notorious for—" "Your bishop," the pompous merchant interrupts, "probably hasn't left his palace in 20 years. I carry significant coin on my person regularly, and I've never had the slightest trouble. It's all about confidence and bearing. Thieves can smell fear, you know. They won't approach a man of obvious quality and determination." You notice he's unconsciously touching the pocket where he presumably keeps his purse, which somewhat undermines his confident speech. The clergyman notices too and shrinks further into himself, clearly regretting initiating this conversation. Historians still argue whether highwaymen were the romantic rogues of popular legend or simply violent criminals whose mythology was inflated by sensationalist broadsheets and nervous travellers. The truth is probably that highway robbery was real, but less common than people believed, concentrated on certain routes and times and wildly exaggerated in the retelling. Your attention shifts to a figure at the far end of the table, who's been silent this entire time, which in this environment is suspicious enough to warrant investigation. He's a broad-shouldered man, maybe 35, wearing a dark riding coat with the collar turned up despite the room's warmth. His hat sits low on his forehead, shadowing his face, and he's nursing his ale while watching the room with the focused attention of a predator or a guardsman. Hard to tell which. When he notices you looking, he raises his tankard slightly in acknowledgement. Not friendly exactly, but not hostile either, just aware. His hands are scarred and calloused, manual work of some kind, but his clothes are too good for a common labourer. He's travelling alone, which is unusual enough for long journeys, and he's positioned himself with his back to the wall and a clear view of both doors. The serving maid approaches him to refill his ale, and you notice how carefully he keeps his hands visible, how he pays her immediately rather than running a tab like most travellers. Everything about his manner suggests someone accustomed to being watched, questioned, or pursued. Here's your quirky tidbit. Coaching inns were favoured meeting places for criminals precisely because of the constant flow of strangers and the chaotic atmosphere that made surveillance difficult. Some establishments gained reputations as safe houses, where wanted men could disappear into the crowd, and landlords carefully maintained neutrality, serving anyone who could pay, asking no questions, seeing nothing worth reporting to magistrates. Now that fellow, William whispers to you, nodding toward the mysterious stranger, might actually be worth worrying about. See how he never turns his back to the room? Either he's a fugitive or he's hunting one. Either way, not someone you want to share a bed with. The pompous merchant signals for another serving of pie, apparently unsatisfied with mere stew, which gives you a moment to observe the broader dining choreography unfolding around you. The serving staff, 3 maids and 2 younger boys who might be the landlord's sons, navigate the chaos with the practiced precision of battlefield surgeons, carrying impossible loads of trenchers, tankards and platters while avoiding collisions, wandering children, and the occasional groping hand that earns a sharp elbow to the ribs. One of the boys emerges from the kitchen carrying what appears to be a roasted chicken, golden and glistening with fat, clearly destined for the private parlour where Mr. Harrison is dining in splendid isolation. The common room watches this delicacy parade past with collective resentment. Your mystery meat stew suddenly feels even more mysterious. That's the 3rd bird they've sent up there, William observes darkly. Meanwhile, we're eating parts of animals that probably died of natural causes last month. The hospitality hierarchy is alive and well, my friend. The nervous clergyman has produced a small notebook and is writing in it with intense concentration, apparently documenting his journey for some reason. You catch a glimpse of his cramped handwriting. November 12th, Red Lion at Barnet, stew of questionable providence, company of varying moral character. He's either planning a published travel memoir or just has too much time on his hands. A fresh wave of travellers pushes through. The main door, passengers from that southbound Edinburgh coach the ostler mentioned. They're louder than your northbound group, fueled by the aggressive confidence of people who've already endured most of their journey and can see London approaching. They claim the remaining bench space with territorial enthusiasm, calling for ale before they've even fully sat down. "Make way for quality," one of them bellows cheerfully. "We've survived Scottish food, Scottish weather and Scottish roads. Nothing you serve here can possibly frighten us." His companions roar approval and pound the table, which makes the candles dance and your stew ripple ominously. The landlady appears at the kitchen entrance and surveys her domain with the calculating gaze of a general reviewing troop deployments. She catches the eye of one of the serving maids and makes a series of hand gestures that apparently communicate complex instructions about who needs what where. The maid nods and adjusts her route accordingly. After decades of running this establishment, the landlady has developed a non-verbal command system more efficient than the Royal Navy's flag signals. Here's a mainstream historical fact for you. The serving staff at coaching inns worked brutal hours, often starting at 4 a.m. to prepare breakfast and not finishing until midnight or later when the last travellers stumbled to bed. They slept in attic spaces or shared rooms and were paid partly in tips, partly in wages, and partly in leftover food and small beer. The turnover rate was enormous. Few people lasted more than a year or two before the exhaustion drove them to different employment. The pompous merchant's pie arrives, and he attacks it with knife and fingers, maintaining a running commentary on its deficiencies. Pastry's too thick, meat's too dry, gravy's too thin. In London, at the 3 Crowns on Cheapside, they serve a game pie that's absolute perfection. Light pastry, rich filling, proper seasoning. Nobody's listening, but he continues anyway. A one-man Greek chorus of culinary criticism. Meanwhile, the mysterious dark-coated stranger has finished his ale and is rising to leave. He moves with economical efficiency, settling his bill with the nearest maid and heading for the stairs without looking back. You notice he keeps his right hand near his coat pocket, where a pistol might rest, until he's out of the common room. The nervous clergyman watches him go with obvious relief. "Told you," William mutters. "Wrong sort entirely. Could be a Jacobite agent. Could be a deserter from the army. Could be a perfectly legitimate businessman with enemies. Either way, I'm glad he's not in my room tonight." Historians still argue whether Jacobite sympathisers and French spies actively used the coaching inn network for intelligence gathering and covert travel, though evidence suggests the government certainly believed they did, planting informants at strategic inns along major routes. Every landlord walked a careful line between cooperating with authorities and maintaining customer privacy. Too much collaboration with either side could destroy your business. A commotion near the fireplace draws your attention. One of the Edinburgh-bound travellers has challenged the fiddle player to a contest, producing his own instrument from a battered case. What follows is less a musical competition and more an auditory assault, with both men soaring away at competing tunes while their respective supporters cheer and heckle. The original fiddle player attempts the Road to Inverness, while his challenger counters with Greensleeves, creating a sonic catastrophe that would make angels weep blood. The landlady allows this to continue for perhaps 30 seconds before she marches over and, without raising her voice or making threats, somehow communicates that the musical duel will cease immediately, or she'll personally ensure both instruments end up firewood. The fiddlers subside into sullen silence. Her authority is absolute. Your trencher is now empty except for a few pieces of gristle you've quietly pushed to one side. The bread is gone, the ale is nearly finished. You're experiencing that peculiar fullness that comes from eating institutional food. Not satisfaction exactly, but the cessation of hunger, which is close enough. Here's a quirky tidbit. Coaching inn trenchers were often made of stale bread rather than wood, with the bread itself soaking up juices and theoretically being edible afterward. This practice had mostly died out by the 18th century, replaced by wooden or pewter plates, but some rural establishments still used bread trenchers for the poorest travellers, who would eat their plate after finishing their meal, the original edible dishware. The serving maid collects your empty trencher with a practice sweep, balancing it atop a stack of 6 others. Anything else? We've got apple tart if you've got room and another couple of pence. You're tempted, genuinely tempted, because the meal was filling but not exactly memorable, and something sweet might improve the whole experience. But your purse is getting lighter by the hour, and you've still got several days of travel ahead. You decline the apple tart with genuine regret and settle back with your remaining ale, resigning yourself to an evening of observation rather than continued consumption. The common room has reached that pleasant equilibrium where most people have eaten. The first round of ale is working its magic, and the general atmosphere shifts from desperate hunger to convivial sociability. Well, convivial in the way that a crowded tavern full of strangers with varying levels of sobriety can be convivial. The fiddle players have reached an uneasy truce and are now playing together, not well but together, working through a repertoire of road songs that everyone vaguely knows but nobody can properly remember. The Coachman's Lament becomes a group sing-along, with increasingly creative interpretations of the lyrics as memory fails and alcohol takes over. You're fairly certain the original version didn't include a verse about a horse that could calculate interest rates, but who's to say? William produces a clay pipe and begins the elaborate ritual of packing and lighting it, using a taper lit from the nearest candle. "You a betting man?" he asks through a cloud of smoke, "because I'll wager you 5 shillings that within the next hour someone will start a heated argument about the young pretender." "Bonnie Prince Charlie?" you ask, keeping your voice carefully neutral. Politics and religion are dangerous topics, even in 1755, a decade after the failed Jacobite rebellion. The very same, never fails. Get enough Englishmen and Scots together in a confined space with sufficient ale, and someone always brings up the 45. Half the room will call him a romantic hero, half will call him a French-backed traitor, and everyone will have remarkably strong opinions about events they mostly learned second-hand. As if summoned by William's prophecy, a voice from the Edinburgh-bound crowd rises above the general din. "All I'm saying is that if Charles Stuart had pressed his advantage after Preston Pans, we'd be singing a different tune today. Here we go." William grins around his pipe stem and settles in to watch the show. "Pressed his advantage?" someone from your northbound group shouts back. "The man barely made it to Derby before turning tail. Some bold Prince of Scotland. Couldn't even reach London before losing his nerve." The debate erupts with the inevitability of a lit fuse reaching powder. The original speaker leaps to his feet, ale sloshing from his tankard. He had 5,000 men against the entire British army. Strategic withdrawal isn't cowardice, it's common sense. Common sense would have been staying in France where he belonged. Historians still argue whether the Jacobite retreat from Derby was a prudent military decision or a catastrophic failure of nerve. with evidence suggesting Charles Stuart's Scottish commanders essentially mutinied, refusing to march further south despite the prince's protests. Either way, the retreat marked the beginning of the end for Jacobite hopes. The landlord appears from somewhere, moving to position himself between the two factions before this escalates from words to fists. Gentlemen, gentlemen, we welcome all travellers here, regardless of their sympathies or their sovereign preferences. The Red Lion is neutral ground. You can argue about politics all you want, but the moment someone throws a punch, you're all sleeping in the stable. Are we clear? The combatants subside into muttered grumbling, though the glares continue. The landlord maintains his position for a moment longer, making eye contact with the troublemakers to ensure his message landed, then retreats to the bar. Crisis averted, at least temporarily. See, William says quietly, like clockwork. By closing time, they'll be best friends or worst enemies, nothing in between. The conversation fragments into smaller groups, everyone processing the near conflict according to their temperament. The nervous clergyman looks positively terrified, apparently convinced that Highland warriors might materialise from the fireplace at any moment. The pompous merchant has opinions about the Jacobites that he's sharing with anyone unfortunate enough to be within earshot. Something about how proper English commerce would have collapsed under Stuart rule, as if anyone asked. More interesting are the quieter conversations happening around the edges. Two farmers near the wall are discussing road conditions north of here, comparing notes on which stretches are passable and which have turned to impassable mud. Don't take the Eastern Fork past Stamford, one advises. Recent rains have turned it to soup. You'll be axle deep within a mile. Western route adds 2 hours, but you'll actually arrive instead of just settling in the mud and establishing a homestead. This is valuable intelligence, and you lean slightly closer to catch the details. Road conditions could add days to your journey or strand you entirely. Another traveller is sketching a crude map on the back of a letter, marking the locations of washed-out bridges and recommended alternate routes. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Coaching in common rooms functioned as informal information exchanges where travellers shared crucial data about road conditions, inequality, dangerous areas and political developments. Before telegraph or reliable postal services, this face-to-face network was how news and intelligence actually travelled, often faster than official channels because travellers had incentive to share accurate information. The musicians have transitioned to something slower and more melancholic, a ballad about a sailor who never returned home. Several voices join in on the chorus, and the mood in the room shifts perceptibly, becoming less raucous and more contemplative. Evening is advancing, ale is taking effect, and people are starting to think about the beds waiting upstairs, and the journey's resuming tomorrow. A quirky tidbit for you. Some coaching inns employed professional tale-tellers who would entertain guests with stories, news and gossip in exchange for drinks and tips. These individuals became walking newspapers, carrying stories from inn to inn along their routes and embellishing enthusiastically. The line between news and entertainment was refreshingly blurry. If a story was boring but true, why not add some fictional pirates to spice things up? Your ale is finished. Your stomach is full. The bench beneath you has become noticeably harder over the past hour, and the warmth from the fireplace is making you drowsy despite the noise. William knocks his pipe against the table edge, dumping ash onto the already filthy floor, and stretches with the elaborate groaning of someone whose back has been complaining for hours. Right then, I'm for bed before I fall asleep in my stew bowl. The Edinburgh coach leaves at 5:30 tomorrow morning, and I intend to be unconscious until at least 5:15. His mention of bed reminds you that you too have sleeping arrangements to investigate, and suddenly the prospect of horizontal rest, any rest, sounds better than all the apple tarts in Christendom. You rise from the bench with a symphony of creaking joints and gather your travelling bag, fishing the wooden token from your pocket to verify which room awaits. The blue room. Second floor, third door on the left. You navigate toward the staircase, dodging a spilled tankard and narrowly avoiding collision with a serving maid carrying dirty trenchers. The stairs are tucked behind a doorway near the kitchen, narrow and steep and worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. The stairwell is notably darker than the common room, lit by a single tallow candle in a wall sconce that's burning more smoke than light. The steps creak ominously under your weight, and somewhere above you hear voices, other travellers already settling into their accommodations, a woman's laugh, a man's cough. The particular sound of someone discovering their room is not quite what they expected. The second-floor landing reveals a corridor running the length of the building, with doors on both sides and one tiny window at the far end showing nothing but darkness. The floorboards up here are even more vocal than the stairs, announcing your presence with groans and squeaks. You count doors, first on the left, second on the left, third on the left, here. The Blue Room's door is rough wood, unpainted despite the optimistic name, with a simple latch and no lock. You lift the latch and push inward, not entirely sure what awaits. The room is, well, it exists. That's about the most charitable assessment you can offer. It's perhaps 10 feet square, with a sloped ceiling following the roofline and one small window with shutters currently closed against the November night. A single candle burns on a small table, providing barely enough light to navigate without walking into furniture, of which there is blessedly little. The bed dominates the space, a substantial wooden frame with a straw-stuffed mattress, pillows of unknown provenance, and blankets that might have been blue once, which presumably explains the room's name. The bed is wide enough for 2 people, assuming those people are comfortable with intimate proximity to strangers, or 3 people, if they're all very thin and none of them move during the night. Currently, the bed contains 1 occupant. He's a man of perhaps 40, wearing a nightshirt and cap, sitting propped against the headboard with a small book in his hands. He looks up as you enter, and his face cycles through surprise, resignation, and weary acceptance in about 2 seconds. "Ah!" My bed companion arrives. I'd hoped they'd forgotten to sell the other half. You introduce yourself and show your token, establishing your legitimate claim to precisely 50% of this mattress. He introduces himself as Thomas, a legal clerk travelling to Edinburgh on court business, exactly as the landlady predicted. His small trunk sits against the wall, his travelling coat hangs from a peg, and his boots are positioned neatly by the door. A man of orderly habits trying to maintain dignity in undignified circumstances. "Fair warning," Thomas says, closing his book and setting it aside. "I apparently snore. My wife has mentioned it. Frequently, with considerable emphasis. So if that's going to be an issue, I suggest we address expectations now." Historians still argue whether bed sharing among strangers was considered normal or merely tolerated as economic necessity, with some evidence suggesting that by the mid-18th century the practice was already declining among middle-class travellers who viewed it as distastefully archaic. Lower-class travellers, and those watching their finances closely, however, continued the tradition well into the 19th century. You assure Thomas that snoring is the least of your concerns after a day of coach travel that's left you capable of sleeping through artillery bombardment. He nods approvingly and gestures toward the other side of the bed. "That's your territory, then. I've taken the liberty of claiming the side nearest the candle since I was here first. There's a chamber pot under the bed. Try not to kick it over in the dark. Learn that lesson the hard way at an inn near York. Still have nightmares." You notice there's a third coat hanging on the wall, which Thomas catches you observing. "Ah, yes, that. The landlady mentioned we might get a third bedmate if the late coach arrives especially full. Something to look forward to. Nothing says restful night like being the meat in a stranger sandwich. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some coaching inns actually advertised guaranteed private sleeping as a premium service, which tells you everything about how common bed sharing was. The practice was so standard that etiquette guides included advice on proper conduct when sharing beds with strangers. Recommendations included: sleep in your clothes, maintain maximum distance, don't speak after lights out, and under no circumstances should you comment on your bedmate's nocturnal emissions of any kind. The bedding itself inspires caution. The linens are greyish-white, changed weekly as promised, which means they've hosted approximately 7 different travellers since their last washing. The blankets are heavy wool, rough enough to exfoliate skin, and they smell of smoke, damp, and generations of human occupation. The pillows are lumpy sacks of something that might be feathers or might be compressed moss. Hard to tell in candlelight, and you're not sure you want to investigate closely. The mattress has personality, Thomas warns. There's a significant valley in the middle where the ropes have stretched. We'll both gradually roll toward the centre during the night unless we actively resist. Consider yourself warned. You begin preparing for bed with the resigned efficiency of someone who's already lowered their standards to floor level. You set your travelling bag on the floor and begin the archaeological excavation of your coat pockets, extracting the day's accumulated debris, toll receipts, a handkerchief of questionable cleanliness, some crumbs from a breakfast you barely remember eating. Thomas watches this process with the sympathetic eye of someone who's performed the same ritual countless times. The room's temperature exists in distinct microclimates. Near the candle, tolerably warm. By the window, Arctic tundra. The middle ground where the bed sits. A negotiated truce between freezing and survivable. You can actually see your breath when you step toward the window to investigate the shutters, which turn out to be latched but not particularly effective at blocking drafts. Cold air seeps through the gaps with determined malice. The shutters are decorative, Thomas observes. I've already tested them. They keep out light and absolutely nothing else. On the positive side, we won't suffocate from lack of fresh air. On the negative side, we won't suffocate because we'll freeze to death first. You notice the walls have that particular texture that comes from multiple layers of whitewash applied over decades, with the current layer flaking in places to reveal earlier generations underneath. Someone has carved initials into the plaster near the door, JM 1748, which means this room has been disappointing travellers for at least 7 years, possibly longer. The mysterious stains you'd rather not investigate are everywhere once you start looking. The floor has dark patches that could be spilled wine, blood, or something best left unexamined. The ceiling shows water damage from a roof leak that may or may not have been repaired. One corner of the mattress has a discoloration that suggests a previous occupant had an unfortunate nocturnal incident, though the landlady's weekly linen changes at least mean you're not sleeping directly on that particular historical artifact. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Coaching in rooms at this social tier rarely included any amenities beyond bed, chamber pot, and perhaps a small table. Washing stands, mirrors, wardrobes, and other furniture were luxuries reserved for the expensive private chambers. Most travellers slept in their undergarments or nightshirts if they had them, keeping their day clothes on the bed for warmth, and considered themselves fortunate if the room had a functional door latch. You remove your coat and waistcoat, hanging them on the remaining wall peg with Thomas's belongings. The room's single candle creates shadows that dance and lurch with every draught, making everything look vaguely sinister. You decide to keep your breeches and shirt on, partly for warmth, partly for modesty, and partly because you're absolutely not investigating what might be living in that mattress, and prefer an extra layer of fabric between you and potential inhabitants. Smart choice, Thomas approves, noting your decision to remain clothed. I made the mistake of undressing completely at an inn near Durham once. Woke up covered in flea bites arranged in patterns that could have been ancient runes. My wife thought I'd developed plague when I arrived home. You sit on your designated half of the bed to remove your boots, and the ropes supporting the mattress creak ominously. Thomas wasn't exaggerating about the valley in the centre. You can feel yourself being pulled toward the middle even while sitting upright. The mattress itself has the consistency of a lumpy sack of grain, with mysterious hard objects scattered throughout that might be compressed straw, actual rocks, or the fossilised remains of previous guests. Historians still argue whether coaching in beds were genuinely as uncomfortable as travellers' accounts suggest, or whether the complaints were exaggerated by exhausted people comparing rustic accommodations to their own beds at home. The truth probably lies somewhere between adequate for the era and instruments of slow torture. Thomas has returned to his book, squinting at the pages in the candlelight. You notice it's a legal text of some kind, not exactly bedtime reading in the conventional sense, but perhaps effectively soporific. Light reading, you ask? Balfour's Practics, he replies without looking up. Scottish legal procedures, absolutely riveting if you enjoy detailed discussions of property law from 1579. I find it helps me sleep. 3 pages and I'm unconscious. 4 pages if I'm particularly anxious. You arrange your boots by the door next to Thomas's, creating a small leather battalion of footwear. The floor is cold enough that you can feel it through your stockings, which encourages rapid movement toward the bed. You pull back the blankets, releasing a smell of wool, smoke and humanity that's probably been building for the full week since the last washing, and slide beneath them. The sheets are coarse linen, cold to the touch, and slightly damp in that way that makes you question whether they're actually clean or just recently rained on. The mattress sags dramatically under your weight, confirming Thomas's warning about the gravitational pull toward the centre. You can already feel yourself slowly rolling toward him, like a ship taking on water. Right then, Thomas says, closing his book and setting it on the floor. Shall we attempt sleep, or would you like to discuss the weather, politics, or other topics we'll both forget by morning? Here's your quirky tidbit. Some travellers carried their own sheets and pillowcases for coaching in stays. rolling them up in their luggage specifically for this purpose. The practice was common enough that inn staff recognised sheet carriers as a distinct class of fussy travellers, though landlords generally didn't object since it saved on laundry costs. The truly paranoid also brought their own chamber pots, which seems excessive until you remember that communal chamber pots were rarely cleaned between uses. You opt for silence, exhaustion having drained any desire for small talk, and Thomas nods approvingly before leaning over to blow out the candle. The darkness that follows is not the comfortable darkness of your bedroom at home, but rather an aggressive physical darkness that feels like it has weight and texture. The only light comes from thin strips around the window shutters, where moonlight or lamplight from the yard manages to penetrate. "Good night, then," Thomas murmurs. "May God grant us rest, minimal bedfellows, and no chamber pot emergencies." "Amen to that," you reply, settling into your half of the mattress and trying to find a position where the lumps don't align perfectly with your spine. For approximately 45 seconds, there is something approaching silence. Then the inn reveals its true nocturnal character. The building itself begins the symphony. The wooden beams overhead contract in the cooling night air with cracks and groans that sound disturbingly like footsteps. The floorboards in the corridor outside produce a constant stream of squeaks and creaks as other travellers navigate to and from the privy in the yard or the chamber pot locations on each floor. Each board has its own distinctive voice. Some squeak, some groan, some produce sounds like minor explosions. Through the walls, which are apparently constructed of paper and optimism rather than actual plaster and timber, you can hear the neighbours with remarkable clarity. To your left, someone is having an enthusiastic coughing fit that sounds like they're trying to expel a lung. To your right, a couple is arguing in fierce whispers about whether they should have taken the coastal route. The same argument you heard downstairs, suggesting they've been having this debate for approximately 8 hours straight with no resolution in sight. Above you, footsteps pace back and forth with metronomic regularity. Someone who can't sleep, or someone guarding something valuable, or possibly just someone with nervous energy, and no consideration for those below. Each step produces a groan from the boards that resonates through your ceiling like a bass drum. Thomas begins to snore approximately 90 seconds after the candle goes out, which must be some kind of record. It's not the gentle snoring of romantic comedies. This is industrial-grade snoring, the kind that suggests his nasal passages are engaged in active warfare with the atmosphere. It starts as a low rumble, builds to a crescendo that could wake the dead, then cuts off abruptly before the cycle repeats. His wife's complaints were apparently well-founded. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of snoring in historical accounts reflects actual sleep disorders, or simply the fact that people sharing small rooms with strangers were more aware of nocturnal sounds they'd normally ignore. Either way, coaching inn travellers developed remarkable tolerance for noise, or they invested heavily in wadded cloth for their ears. From somewhere downstairs you hear the muffled sounds of the common room still in operation. Laughter, the scrape of benches, someone singing off-key. The late-night crowd who'll stay drinking until the landlord physically evicts them, or until they pass out, whichever comes first. You hear a crash, breaking crockery probably, followed by male laughter and the landlady's voice cutting through like a knife, her exact words inaudible, but her tone of absolute authority unmistakable. Then there are the rats. You hear them first in the walls, scurrying, scratching, squeaking conversations in whatever language rats use to discuss the evening's scavenging opportunities. The inn's structure apparently contains the entire civilization of rodents, living parallel lives to the human occupants, using the spaces between walls and floors as their highways and gathering places. One particularly bold specimen scratches at the baseboard near your head with determined enthusiasm, apparently trying to excavate a new entrance directly into your room. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Rats were so common in coaching inns that most establishments kept cats, terriers, or both to manage the population. Some inns advertised their rat-catching prowess as a selling point. Cleanest establishment on the North Road, guaranteed minimal rodent encounters. Which tells you both that rats were ubiquitous, and that their absence was noteworthy enough to merit advertising. A new sound joins the chorus. Hoofbeats in the yard, the jingle of harness, voices shouting instructions. Another coach arriving, the late stage from somewhere south, bringing fresh travellers and fresh chaos. You hear the ostlers responding, stable doors opening, horses being led away. Through your inadequate shutters, you glimpse lantern lights swinging across the yard as grooms work to settle the new arrivals. The building responds to this influx like an organism accepting new cells. More footsteps in the corridor, more voices, more doors opening and closing. Someone walks past your door so heavily that your chamber pot rattles under the bed. Thomas's snoring never wavers. The man could sleep through a naval bombardment. Somewhere a baby begins crying, that particularly penetrating wail that infant lungs can produce at 3 a.m. The sound carries through the walls with perfect clarity, suggesting the parents are in the room directly adjacent. You hear a woman's exhausted voice attempting comfort, a man's grumbling about the impossibility of sleep, and the baby's complete indifference to both, continuing its vocal performance with operatic commitment. A quirky tidbit for your middle-of-the-night contemplation. Some coaching inns installed bells in rooms that could ring down to the kitchen or landlord's quarters for service. But these were often removed because drunk travellers would ring them repeatedly at 2 a.m, demanding more ale, companionship, or philosophical discussions about the nature of existence. The bells that remained were in the expensive private chambers only, where guests were presumably too wealthy or dignified for 2 a.m. nonsense. You've resigned yourself to wakefulness, or at least that twilight state between consciousness and sleep where you're aware of everything, but can't quite organise coherent thoughts about it. Thomas's snoring has achieved a steady rhythm that's almost hypnotic if you stop fighting it and accept it as this new baseline reality. The baby next door has either fallen asleep or been smothered. You're trying not to speculate which. Through the thin walls and floor, you can track the inn's nocturnal operations with surprising clarity. The common room finally quiets around midnight, which you know because you hear the landlord's voice bellowing, "Time, gentlemen, out or up, I'm not running a charity," followed by the scraping of benches and the shuffling migration of the last drinkers toward either their beds or the door. But the stable yard below your window continues its own separate existence, operating on a schedule dictated by coach departures rather than human sleep requirements. You hear voices down there, the ostlers and grooms who work the night shift, tending the horses that arrived exhausted and preparing fresh teams for tomorrow's departures. A door opens and closes somewhere beneath you, and you catch fragments of conversation between two men discussing a horse's lameness. Near forelegs swollen. Can't put him in the morning team. Try the poultice again, and if it's not better by dawn, we'll substitute Blackie. Their voices fade as they move deeper into the stable. The stables at a coaching in this size represent a substantial operation. 40 to 50 horses at any given time, in various states of readiness, exhaustion, injury, or simple bad temper. The animals that pulled your coach from London are down there now, being rubbed down, watered, fed, their harness removed and checked for damage. Fresh straw is being spread in their stalls. Any injuries or problems are being noted for the head ostler's attention in the morning. Meanwhile, the next teams are being prepared. Hooves picked clean of stones and packed mud. Manes combed free of tangles. Minor harness repairs completed by candlelight. The horses that will pull the 5:30 Edinburgh stage need to be ready, fed and reasonably fresh, which means the ostlers are working through the night on a schedule that would break most people within a week. Historians still argue whether stable hands at coaching inns were skilled professionals deserving of respect, or simply the lowest tier of service workers, exploited ruthlessly by landlords focused on profit. The truth is probably that quality varied enormously. Some establishments employed expert horsemen who could diagnose lameness by sound and treat injuries with remarkable skill, while others hired whoever was desperate enough to work for minimal wages and barn sleeping, quarters. You hear a horse kick its stall door with a bang that resonates through the building's frame. "Easy there, you bastard," comes a voice from below, affectionate despite the profanity. "I know you're tired. We're all bloody tired. But that's no excuse for property damage." A pause, then, "Yes, I'm talking to a horse at 1 a.m. What's your point?" The ostler's world exists in parallel to the traveller's world, intersecting only briefly during those moments of arrival and departure, when grooms rush forward to handle the exhausted teams and bring out the replacements. But between those public performances, there's this entire hidden operation, the feeding, grooming, mucking out stalls, treating injuries, repairing tack and maintaining the complex machinery that keeps the coaching network functioning. Here's your mainstream historical fact. A good coaching inn maintained at least 3 complete teams of horses for each regular route it served, allowing for rotation and rest. The animals worked brutal schedules, A 10-mile stage at speed could exhaust a team completely, requiring hours of recovery before they could work again. Horses that broke down or went permanently lame were sold off to farmers for light work or, if too damaged, sent to the knacker for slaughter. The turnover was constant and expensive. Another sound drifts up from below, someone singing quietly, one of those working songs that helps pass the time during tedious labour. You can't make out the words, but the melody is simple and repetitive, probably bawdy, knowing stable humour. The singer works while he sings, and you hear the rhythmic sounds of someone forking fresh hay into mangers, the swish and thump, creating a counterpoint to the melody. A cat yowls somewhere in the yard, the rat catchers working their own night shift, patrolling for the rodents that would otherwise overrun the feed stores and harness rooms. You hear a brief scuffle, a squeak cut short, and then silence. The circle of life continues in miniature below your window. Thomas rolls over in his sleep, nearly kicking you in the process, and his snoring pauses for a blessed moment, before resuming at a slightly different pitch. You've given up on the Centre Valley problem. You're both gradually sliding toward the middle of the mattress like continents drifting toward collision, and there's nothing to be done about it except accept that you'll wake up far closer to Thomas than either of you intended. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some coaching inns employed horse listeners, experienced ostlers who could diagnose problems by the sounds horses made during the night. A particular type of cough might indicate respiratory infection. Restless movement could signal colic. Aggressive kicking might mean the horse was being bothered by stable mates or had an injury being aggravated by position. These listeners made rounds throughout the night, their ears tuned to detect problems before they became crises that could delay morning departures. You've achieved something resembling sleep, not deep, not restful, but that shallow dozing state where you're vaguely aware of your surroundings, while your consciousness takes unauthorized breaks. Dreams flicker past like images viewed through dirty glass. Coach wheels, endless roads, mutton stew achieving sentience and filing complaints about its treatment. Then a new sound penetrates your semi-conscious state. Footsteps below, but different from the stable activity. These are indoors, purposeful, accompanied by the clatter of pots and the scrape of furniture being moved. You crack one eye open, still dark, the strips of light around the shutters showing no hint of dawn. What kind of madness happens at this hour? Kitchen madness, as it turns out. You hear a woman's voice below, muffled by flaws and distance, but carrying the tone of someone issuing commands to the sleep-deprived. Get those ovens fired up properly. I want them hot enough to see God by the time we start the bread, and someone fetch more water before I have to do everything myself. The cook has risen, and with her the daily miracle of feeding 80 to 100 people, breakfast begins. The sounds drift up through the floorboards with increasing clarity as your unwilling consciousness tracks the kitchen's transformation from dormant to operational. The bang of oven doors, the splash of water into kettles, the scrape of a poker stirring embers back to life. You estimate the time at perhaps 3 a.m, maybe slightly later, which means the kitchen staff has been awake for approximately 5 minutes and already sounds exhausted. Thomas continues snoring beside you with the serenity of someone whose profession doesn't require pre-dawn consciousness. The lucky bastard. More sounds from below, the rhythmic thump of dough being kneaded on a wooden table, aggressive enough that you feel faint vibrations through your mattress. Whoever's working that dough is either remarkably strong or taking out considerable frustration on innocent flour and water. The cook's voice again. Put your back into it, girl. That bread won't knead itself, and we've got 40 loaves to finish before the first departures. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Coaching in kitchens operated on punishing schedules, with bread baking beginning around 3 a.m. to ensure fresh loaves for breakfast service starting at 6 a.m. The ovens, massive brick structures that could accommodate a dozen loaves at once, needed hours to reach proper temperature, and the bread itself required time to rise, shape, and bake. Establishments that served stale or poorly made bread quickly gained reputations that could destroy their business, so the quality of the 3 a.m. baking session was economically critical. The smell reaches you next. Wood smoke first as the ovens roar to life, followed gradually by the yeasty aroma of bread dough. It's actually pleasant, cutting, through the room's prevailing odour of old wool and compressed humanity. Your stomach, apparently still awake despite your brain's protests, responds with interest. The mystery stew from supper is a distant memory now, and the prospect of fresh bread becomes unexpectedly appealing. You hear what sounds like a younger voice, a scullery maid probably, asking a question you can't quite make out. The cook's response is perfectly audible. Because if we don't have breakfast ready when the Edinburgh stage loads, the landlord will have both our heads on platters, that's why. Now stop asking stupid questions and start slicing that bacon! The bacon reference triggers another wave of smells drifting upward. Pork fat beginning to sizzle, adding its contribution to the olfactory landscape. Someone's frying bacon at 3 a.m, which seems both insane and somehow admirable. The dedication to feeding travellers operates on a schedule that makes no concessions to human biology or reasonable working hours. Historians still argue whether coaching in kitchen staff were paid fairly for their brutal schedules, with evidence suggesting wages varied wildly by establishment and region. Some cooks and senior kitchen workers earned respectable incomes and wielded considerable authority, while scullery maids at the bottom of the hierarchy worked 14-hour days for wages barely above subsistence level, plus whatever leftover food they could claim. More activity below, the clank of metal against metal as pots and pans are selected and arranged. The splash of milk being poured, probably into porridge pots since oatmeal was standard breakfast fare alongside bread and cold meat. The cook issues another stream of instructions, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone who's had this same conversation daily for 20 years and has lost patience with the universe's refusal to learn. A crash, something dropped or knocked over, followed by swearing creative enough that you're impressed despite the early hour. Pick it up, clean it up, and if you break another bowl, I'm deducting it from your wages. Those bowls cost money, unlike certain people who apparently cost me my sanity. You're building a mental picture of the kitchen even though you can't see it. A large room dominated by the massive ovens, probably with an open fireplace for cooking as well. Wooden work tables scarred by decades of chopping and kneading. Shelves loaded with pots, pans, crockery and ingredients. Barrels of flour and salt. Strings of onions hanging from rafters. And somewhere in this organised chaos, 3 or 4 women working at speeds that would exhaust Olympic athletes, transforming raw ingredients into the breakfast that 80 travellers expect to appear magically at 6 a.m. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some coaching-in cooks kept perpetual porridge pots, simmering overnight, adding fresh oats and liquid each morning to the previous day's base. The practice was efficient, but occasionally resulted in porridge layers that could be dated like tree rings. Archaeologists of breakfast could theoretically identify oats from different weeks, all mixed together in one bowl. Food safety standards were, shall we say, flexible. The kitchen's industrious chaos continues below, but now you hear new activity, this time from the front of the building. Hoofbeats in the yard, urgent and irregular, not the disciplined rhythm of a scheduled coach arrival. Voices shouting with an edge that suggests something beyond routine travel fatigue. You hear the landlord's boots thumping down the stairs. He must have been roused from whatever minimal sleep innkeepers are allowed, and the front door banging open. Thomas's snoring falters for a moment as the commotion penetrates even his unconscious state, but he doesn't wake, merely shifts position and resumes his nasal symphony at a slightly higher pitch. The man could sleep through the apocalypse, which you're beginning to envy rather than resent. The voices from the yard grow more distinct as multiple people converge on the new arrival. Wheel completely shattered, just exploded like a cannon shot. Threw 3 of us clear into the ditch. Thought we were being attacked, but it was just the bloody axle giving way. A coach accident then. Common enough on these roads, where deep ruts, hidden stones and simple mechanical failure could transform a routine journey into a disaster within seconds. You hear the landlord's voice, professionally concerned but also calculating. Injured travellers mean rooms rented, meals sold, possibly a surgeon summoned at premium rates. Every crisis is also a business opportunity. The yard fills with activity as ostlers help passengers down from what remains of their coach. You hear a woman crying, though whether from pain, shock, or simple exhaustion is impossible to determine. A man's voice, trying for authoritative calm but shaking slightly. Everyone inside, let's get you warm and assess the damage. Is anyone seriously injured? Through your inadequate shutters, you glimpse lantern light dancing across the yard as the rescue operation proceeds. The damaged coach must be spectacular. You hear the ostlers discussing it in tones mixing professional assessment with morbid fascination. Never seen a wheel fail quite like that. Lucky they weren't going full speed or someone would be dead. Footsteps on the stairs now, multiple sets, some steady and some limping. The late-night arrivals are being guided to whatever accommodations remain, which probably means the common sleeping room or possibly the stable loft. You hear the landlord's wife directing traffic. Mind the third step, it's loose. Yes, there's hot water for washing. No, the surgeon won't come until morning unless someone's actively dying. The door to the adjacent room opens and closes, and suddenly you can hear the accident survivors with remarkable clarity. 4 or 5 people talking over each other with that particular energy that comes from surviving something terrifying and needing to process it through endless retelling. I'm telling you, we were lucky. The voice belongs to a man, older, still breathing hard, from either exertion or shock. Another 100 yards and we'd have been on that steep section near the ravine. Wheel fails there and we're not walking into a nice warm inn. We're tumbling down a cliff. It wasn't luck. It was divine providence. A woman's voice trembling with religious fervour, or possibly just regular trembling from cold and fear. The Lord was watching over us. I felt his hand guide us to safety. Historians still argue whether coach accidents were genuinely as frequent as travellers' accounts suggest, or whether the dramatic stories were amplified by survivor bias. People who had uneventful journeys didn't write breathless letters about safely arriving on schedule. Statistical evidence suggests accidents were common enough that most regular travellers experienced at least one significant incident, though fatal crashes were relatively rare compared to minor breakdowns. Another voice joins, younger and more sceptical. Providence or not, we're stranded here until the wheelwright can fabricate a replacement, which means at least 2 days. 2 days! I'm supposed to be in Newcastle tomorrow for business that cannot wait. Then perhaps you should have chosen a coach company that maintains its equipment properly, the older man snaps back. I saw that wheel when we loaded this morning. The spokes were already showing cracks. I should have refused to board, but did anyone listen? No. The argument escalates briefly before someone, probably the woman, mediates with exhausted patience. You hear the sounds of people settling into their room, removing wet or muddy outer garments, discovering whatever accommodations await them. Then a new voice, one you haven't heard yet, speaks with the careful deliberation of someone trying to sound calmer than they feel. At least we weren't attacked. I heard from a merchant in London that the stretch north of here has been plagued by highwaymen. He said they stopped his coach just last month, took everything of value and left them walking. This triggers an enthusiastic exchange of highway robbery stories, each participant apparently eager to share the most terrifying tale they've heard secondhand. The nervous energy of people who've just survived one danger, now processing all the other dangers they could have encountered instead. My cousin was held up near Stevenage, someone volunteers. The robber was apparently quite polite about it, said, "Your money or your life, and I do apologise for the inconvenience." Even returned her wedding ring when she explained its sentimental value. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Highway robbery peaked in the early to mid-18th century, with certain routes being notorious hunting grounds for gentlemen of the road. However, the actual frequency was lower than popular culture suggested. Most coaches completed their journeys unmolested. The robberies that did occur were sensationalized in newspapers and broadsheets, creating a perception of danger that exceeded statistical reality, much like modern crime reporting. "Polite robbers," another voice scoffs. "I heard about a gang operating near the Scottish border that strips victims completely naked and leaves them tied to trees. No romance or courtesy there, just brutality and humiliation." The highway robbery discussion next door eventually exhausts itself, replaced by the sounds of people arranging themselves for whatever sleep remains of the night. You hear the creak of bed ropes, muttered complaints about cold and discomfort, and finally a gradual settling into something resembling quiet. The crisis has been absorbed into the inn's normal operations, the survivors integrated into the building's population as seamlessly as your own group was hours earlier. But the inn itself doesn't sleep. You're becoming aware of this establishment as less a building and more an organism, constantly metabolizing travellers and resources through interconnected systems that never fully shut down. From somewhere below, you hear the distinctive clink of coins being counted. The landlord or his wife doing accounts, probably, reconciling the day's takings and expenses. The coaching inn operates as a complex financial instrument. simultaneously functioning as hotel, tavern, restaurant, stable, and informal bank. Every transaction flows through the landlord's hands: room fees, meal charges, ale sales, horse changes, storage fees for trunks and parcels, tips for servants, bribes for better accommodations. The numbers must be staggering. On a busy night like this, the Red Lion might host 80 to 100 travellers paying for beds, another 40 stopping just for meals and horse changes, plus local customers drinking in the common room. Add the fees for stabling private horses, storing goods awaiting collection, and providing meeting space for local businesses, and you're looking at daily revenues that would make most merchants envious. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Successful coaching inn landlords were often among the wealthiest individuals in their communities, with the most profitable establishments generating annual incomes equivalent to minor gentry. Some landlords owned multiple properties along coach routes, creating small hospitality empires. The position required substantial capital to establish: buildings, horses, equipment, licenses, but could generate returns of 20 to 30% annually if managed competently. You hear footsteps in the corridor, someone moving with purpose despite the hour. A door opens 2 rooms down and you catch fragments of conversation. Package for Edinburgh? Needs to go on the morning coach. Already paid, just need you to guarantee delivery. The landlady's voice, ever professional. We'll see it aboard the 5:30 stage. That'll be an additional 3p for guaranteed placement. The inn functions as an unofficial postal service, you realise. Parcels, letters, small goods, all moving, all along the coach network, entrusted to guards and drivers, handed from inn to inn in a chain of custody that somehow works despite having no formal organisation. The landlord and landlady know every driver, every guard, every other innkeeper along the route. They're nodes in an information and logistics network that spans the country. Another door, another transaction. This one sounds like someone pawning jewellery. A traveller short of funds negotiating with the landlord for a loan against a pocket watch or ring. The coaching inn as informal bank, extending credit to stranded travellers, holding valuables in the strongbox behind the bar, occasionally even issuing promissory notes that could be redeemed at other establishments along the route. Historians still argue whether coaching inn credit systems were exploitative or genuinely helpful, with evidence suggesting tremendous variation. Some landlords charged reasonable interest and returned pawned items faithfully. Others operated as loan sharks, using travellers' desperation to extract maximum profit from minimum risk. The lack of regulation meant everything depended on individual character, and travellers had little recourse against dishonest operators. Thomas shifts in his sleep, his arm flopping across the centre valley of the mattress, and nearly striking you in the face. You adjust to avoid contact, which means you're now balanced precariously on approximately 8 inches of mattress edge, fighting gravity's constant pull toward the middle. This is not sustainable, but you're too tired to engineer a better solution. From the kitchen, new sounds: the scrape of bread loaves being removed from ovens, the rich smell of fresh baking intensifying. The cook and her staff are hitting their stride now, the breakfast production entering its critical phase. In 3 hours, travellers will descend expecting hot food immediately, and the kitchen's 3 a.m. labours will determine whether that expectation is met or disappointed. You hear horses in the yard again, the ostlers bringing out the team for the early Edinburgh stage. Even at this ungodly hour, the coaching schedule marches forward with mechanical precision. The 5:30 departure requires horses ready at 5:15, which means the ostlers are harnessing and hitching now, working by lantern light to ensure everything is prepared. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some coaching inn landlords operated as informal intelligence gatherers for the government, reporting suspicious travellers, unusual conversations, or potentially seditious activities. The position was unofficial and unpaid, motivated partly by patriotism and partly by the understanding that maintaining good relations with magistrates and government officials was excellent for business. A landlord's word could get a competitor's licence revoked or secure preferential treatment for his own establishment. The building creaks and settles around you, its timber frame adjusting to temperature changes, the weight of 70-odd sleeping bodies distributed through its rooms, the constant activity in kitchen and stable, creating vibrations that travel through the structure. You're lying in the heart of a small economy, a machine designed to extract maximum revenue from the constant flow of travellers while providing just enough service to keep them coming back. The landlord and his wife are the orchestrators of this complex operation, managing servants, negotiating with coach companies, maintaining relationships with merchants who supply food and goods, handling disputes between drunk customers, extending credit to known travellers, and somehow sleeping perhaps 4 hours a night while maintaining the appearance of hospitality and competence. As you lie there in your half-bed purgatory, gradually accepting that real sleep is a fantasy, you become increasingly aware of the coaching inn's invisible but absolute social hierarchy. The building itself is a physical manifestation of 18th century class structure, with each floor and room type representing a different rung on the social ladder. Above you, literally above you on the 3rd floor, Mr. Harrison sleeps in solitary splendour in the best chamber, the one with actual curtains, a warming pan for the sheets, and enough space that he could perform a small dance without striking furniture. You can't hear him at all, which is the point. The expensive rooms are positioned to maximise quiet and privacy, insulated from the chaos below by floors, walls, and sheer financial superiority. His supper was served in the private parlour on a real tablecloth, with multiple courses, including that roasted chicken you watched parade past. His chamber pot is probably porcelain rather than earthenware, emptied promptly by a servant who doesn't also serve the common travellers. His bed features fresh linens changed daily, not weekly, and a mattress stuffed with actual feathers rather than questionable straw and historical debris. For 2 shillings 6pence per night, he's purchased not just accommodation, but separation from people like you. The ability to pretend that coaching travel is genteel and civilized, rather than a chaotic collision of unwashed strangers, united only by their need to get somewhere else. Meanwhile, below you in the stable loft, men sleep on hay bales for a penny per night, sharing space with horses, rats, and the persistent smell of manure. They're the labourers, the apprentices, the truly desperate, people for whom even 3pence for the common sleeping room represents an unaffordable luxury. They'll wake with hay in their hair and horse stink in their clothes, but they'll have survived the night without spending money they need for food. You're in the middle tier, the mediocre bourgeoisie of coaching in accommodation, not poor enough for the stable, not rich enough for privacy, sharing beds with strangers, but at least sharing beds indoors, eating the same questionable stew as everyone else but eating it, sitting down rather than standing in the cold. Historians still argue whether coaching inns represented a democratizing force, where all classes mixed freely, or simply reproduced existing social hierarchies in miniature, with the physical architecture ensuring that the wealthy remained comfortably separated from the poor despite technically occupying the same building. Here's the thing about social mixing in 18th century England. It happens, but carefully, with invisible rules that everyone understands and nobody needs to explain. Mr. Harrison walked through the common room to reach the stairs, technically sharing space with farmers and merchants and nervous clergymen, but he didn't sit among them, didn't eat with them, didn't acknowledge their existence except as obstacles to navigate around. The farmers sleeping in the stable loft probably helped maintain the roads he travelled on, grew the food he ate, built the coaches he rode in. But the social distance between them and Mr. Harrison might as well be measured in miles rather than feet. They could be separated by 2 floors and 20 feet of timber, yet they inhabit completely different worlds. You hear movement from the direction of those private parlours, a door opening, footsteps, a cultured voice saying, "More coal for the fire, if you please," to some servant who's apparently awake and working at 4 in the morning. The wealthy don't just buy better rooms, they buy the labour of people who sacrifice sleep to maintain their comfort. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Private parlours at coaching inns often featured separate entrances, allowing wealthy travellers to avoid the common areas entirely, entering and exiting without witnessing or being witnessed by lower-class patrons. Some establishments even maintained separate kitchens or cooking areas for private service, ensuring that aristocratic meals were prepared in spaces untainted by association with common food preparation. The serving staff navigate these class boundaries constantly, adjusting their demeanour based on who they're addressing. You noticed it earlier, the landlord's obsequious bowing to Mr. Harrison versus his brisk efficiency with you, versus what's probably barely concealed contempt for the stable loft penny sleepers, each interaction calibrated to the customer's perceived wealth and social status. The maids who empty chamber pots in the expensive rooms are probably the same ones who serve stew in the common room, but they perform these roles as if they're completely different people, deferential and nearly invisible upstairs, harried and sharp-tongued downstairs, The ability to code switch between social registers is a survival skill for anyone working in service. A quirky tidbit for your contemplation. Some coaching inns maintain separate entrances and staircases for different classes of travellers, literally preventing physical contact between wealthy patrons and common folk. The most elaborate establishments featured quality staircases with carpeting and portraits versus public stairs that were bare wood and dimly lit. You could stay in the same building yet never actually encounter guests from different social tiers. Even in sleep, or attempted sleep, the hierarchy persists. Mr. Harrison above you is probably resting comfortably in temperature-controlled luxury. You're fighting Thomas for mattress space and trying not to think about what's living in the blankets. The stable loft sleepers are huddling together for warmth. Their body heat and the horses' combined warmth, the only thing preventing hypothermia. Come morning, these divisions will be even more obvious. Mr. Harrison will receive breakfast in his parlour, fresh bread, butter, cold meats, perhaps eggs prepared to his specification. You'll eat in the common room with everyone else, standing around tables grabbing what's available before it runs out. The stable loft penny sleepers probably won't get breakfast at all unless they've paid extra for it, which they almost certainly haven't. Your contemplation of social hierarchies is interrupted by urgent commotion in the yard. More horses arriving, but these sound panicked rather than merely tired. Voices shouting with genuine alarm rather than routine instruction. Get the landlord! We need the landlord now! Thomas's snoring finally ceases as even he can't sleep through this level of chaos. What in God's name? He mumbles, disoriented, before the urgency in the voices outside penetrates his consciousness. You both lie there listening, too invested in the drama to attempt returning to sleep. Heavy boots pound up the stairs, the landlord, you presume, summoned from wherever he was attempting to catch a few precious minutes of rest. His voice booms from the corridor. What's happened? Overturned coach 2 miles south. The response comes from what sounds like a coach guard, breathing hard from either exertion or panic. 6 passengers, 2 seriously injured. We got them into the mail cart and brought them here. One's bleeding badly. The other might have broken bones. We need... Get them inside, the landlord interrupts, already moving into crisis management mode. Mary, wake the household. We need hot water, bandages, and someone fetch whatever passes for the surgeon around here. The building erupts into activity like a kicked anthill. Doors bang open. Footsteps thunder in all directions. The landlady's voice cuts through the chaos with military precision, issuing orders. You stoke the common room fires higher. You get clean linens from the storage chest. Someone light every candle we have downstairs. We need to see what we're dealing with. You and Thomas exchange glances in the darkness. This is clearly not routine business, and the sounds suggest genuine emergency, rather than the exaggerated drama of earlier arrivals. Through your inadequate shutters, you glimpse lantern light flooding the yard as ostlers and servants converge on the mail cart. Should we? Thomas begins, uncertain. Probably stay out of the way, you reply, though you're both already moving. Curiosity overriding common sense. You fumble for your breeches in the dark, pulling them on with the graceless urgency of people who've been awakened from almost sleep. The corridor is chaos as you emerge. Other travellers have appeared from various rooms, drawn by the commotion like moths to flame. The nervous clergyman hovers near the stairs, wringing his hands. William the cloth merchant has materialised fully dressed, suggesting he either sleeps in his clothes or dresses with supernatural speed. From below you hear the sounds of injured people being brought inside. Groaning, crying, the landlady's voice attempting comfort. Easy now. We've got you. You're safe. The scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor, probably an improvised stretcher. You descend the stairs with the growing crowd of spectators, following the commotion to the common room where the fireplace has been. Stoked into a roaring blaze, and every available surface now hosts candles. The injured passengers are being laid on tables that hours earlier held trenchers of stew. The same tables where you ate supper, now serving as emergency surgery platforms. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Coaching in landlords often provided basic medical care in emergencies, having learned practical first aid through years of treating injuries from coach accidents, horse kicks, and drunken brawls. Some kept medical supplies on hand, bandages, basilicum ointment, laudanum for pain, and the better establishments maintained relationships with local surgeons who could be summoned for serious cases, though response times of several hours were common. The first patient is a middle-aged woman, conscious but clearly in shock, her arm bent at an angle that makes your stomach clench. The landlady is already examining it with the brisk efficiency of someone who's done this before. Broken? Definitely broken. We'll need to splint it, but wait for the surgeon to set it properly. For now, let's get her comfortable and warm. The second patient is worse. A younger man, maybe 30, with a gash across his forehead that's bleeding enthusiastically despite someone's attempt to staunch it with what looks like someone's cravat, now sodden and crimson. He's semi-conscious, mumbling incoherently, his eyes unfocused. The landlord kneels beside him, peeling back the makeshift bandage to assess the damage. Head wounds always bleed like the apocalypse, he mutters, more to himself than anyone. Could be worse than it looks, could be nothing. Impossible to tell until he wakes up properly or doesn't. His bedside manner could use work. I've sent for the surgeon, the landlady reports, appearing with an armful of clean linen. Though God knows when he'll arrive. Last time we needed him urgently, he was 3 villages away pulling a tooth and didn't appear for 6 hours. Historians still argue whether coaching in medical care did more good than harm, with some evidence suggesting that landlords' practical experience sometimes produced better outcomes than formally trained surgeons whose methods included enthusiastic bleeding, mercury treatments, and other interventions that were actively counterproductive. The debate continues over whether experience or education mattered more in 18th century medicine. The cook has appeared from the kitchen, bringing hot water and clean cloths, transforming from breakfast tyrant to emergency nurse with seamless efficiency. Between the landlord, landlady and cook, they've probably treated dozens of accident victims over the years. Broken bones, lacerations, concussions, the occasional death they couldn't prevent. A quirky tidbit. Some coaching inns kept accident books documenting injuries and treatments, partly for legal protection and partly as medical reference. These ledgers provide fascinating insights into 18th century trauma care. March 3rd, 1752. Passenger fell from roof, broken leg, treated with splint and rum, survived. April 17th, 1752. Horse-kicked stable boy, jaw broken, wired shut with silver wire, mostly survived. The emergency transforms the common room into an improvised hospital ward, but the inn's other operations continue with barely a pause. You notice one of the chambermaids hovering at the edge of the scene, a young woman perhaps 20 years old, carrying a tray laden with chamber pots. She's waiting for the crisis to clear enough that she can navigate through without appearing callous or getting in the way. Her name is Alice. You overhear the landlady bark, "Alice!" Once this settles, rooms 3 through 7 need chamber pots replaced. And she manages to look simultaneously exhausted and alert, which you're beginning to recognise as the standard expression of coaching in servants. She catches you watching and offers a tiny shrug that communicates volumes. This is just another night. Welcome to the chaos. The landlady finally waves her through, and Alice navigates the makeshift medical scene with practiced efficiency, heading for the stairs with her tray of ceramic vessels. You follow at a distance, partly from curiosity and partly because returning to bed seems impossible now that you're fully awake and have witnessed genuine human suffering downstairs. Alice's route takes her along the second-floor corridor, where she moves with the quiet confidence of someone who could navigate this building blindfolded. She stops at the first door, produces a key from her apron pocket, and enters without knocking. Apparently chambermaid duties override privacy at 4 a.m. You hear muffled sounds from inside, the clink of ceramic, footsteps, a drawer opening and closing. 30 seconds later, she emerges with a full chamber pot wrapped in cloth to minimise smell and slosh. The replacement pot, fresh, or at least recently rinsed, has been delivered. "Don't suppose you'd like to help?" Alice asks, noticing you lingering in the corridor. There's no real expectation in her voice, just the faint hope that occasionally gets disappointed. You actually find yourself saying yes, partly from residual adrenaline from the emergency downstairs, and partly because standing uselessly in a dark corridor seems worse than being useful. She hands you 2 empty chamber pots from her tray with a grin that suggests she's successfully recruited unexpected labour before. "Room 5 needs these," she instructs, pointing. "Just swap them for the full ones under the bed. Try not to wake anyone, and definitely don't spill anything. The laundryman charges extra for accidents, and it comes out of my wages." Here's your mainstream historical fact. Chambermaids at coaching inns worked 18-hour shifts that began around 4 a.m. and ended near 10 p.m. performing tasks that range from emptying chamber pots to changing linens to delivering food to smuggling lovers between rooms for wealthy guests who tipped generously for discretion. The position paid roughly £6 to £8 annually, plus room, board and whatever tips they could collect, about a third of what a skilled male servant would earn for comparable work. You enter room 5 as quietly as possible, trying not to think too hard about what you're doing. The occupants, 2 men sharing a bed similar to your arrangement with Thomas, are both snoring peacefully, completely unaware of your intrusion. You locate the chamber pots under the bed, carefully extract the full ones and replace them with your empties. Mission accomplished with minimal dignity but maximum efficiency. Alice collects the full pots from you with a nod of approval. Not bad for amateur work. Most guests who offer to help either wake everyone up or drop things. She's already moving to the next room, her system clearly refined through endless repetition. As you follow her progress through the corridor, you begin to understand the chambermaid's night shift as its own form of theatre. She enters rooms where couples are sleeping, or pretending to sleep, or actively not sleeping in ways that make her carefully avert her eyes. She navigates around drunk travellers who've passed out in corridors. She dodges the occasional handsy guest emerging from rooms who thinks 4 a.m, and minimal witnesses create opportunity for unwanted advances. You learn to keep moving, Alice explains quietly when one such guest, middle-aged, wig askew, breath that could strip paint, attempts to corner her near the stairwell. She sidesteps with practiced ease, keeping her tray between them like a shield. And you learn which rooms to enter only when you have witnesses nearby. Historians still argue whether sexual harassment of female servants was universally tolerated, or whether some establishment owners actually protected their staff, with evidence suggesting enormous variation. Some landlords would immediately evict guests who mistreated servants. Others essentially treated harassment as a perk wealthy travellers could purchase along with their rooms. The chambermaid's knowledge of the building's secrets is encyclopedic. She knows which rooms house legitimate married couples versus which contain unmarried lovers who paid extra for discretion. She knows who's travelling on business versus who's running from debts or spouses or the law. She knows which trunks contain expensive goods versus which passengers are near penniless and bluffing. "See room 8, Alice whispers, pausing outside a door. That gentleman told the landlord he's a prosperous merchant travelling to Edinburgh on important business. Paid for the room in copper pennies counted out one at a time, nearly fainted when asked about dinner charges. His trunk's empty. I checked when making the bed. He's running from something or towards something, and either way he'll probably leave without paying if he can manage it." This intelligence network runs through the servant, corridors and back staircases that wealthy guests never see. The chambermaids, bootblacks, ostlers and scullery maids know everything because they're everywhere, and wealthy travellers talk freely in front of them because servants are functionally invisible to the upper classes, a quirky tidbit. Some chambermaids at coaching inns ran lucrative side businesses selling information, telling merchants which travellers were carrying cash, informing jealous spouses about infidelities, even alerting highwaymen about particularly wealthy coaches. The position's access to private spaces and conversations made it perfect for intelligence gathering, and the poverty wages encouraged entrepreneurial approaches to income supplementation. Alice completes her rounds with the efficiency of a military operation, collecting full chamber pots, delivering fresh ones, noting which rooms need extra linens or have made unusual messes requiring special cleaning. Alice's final stop is the kitchen disposal area behind the building, where the contents of chamber pots are emptied into a trench that drains away from the well, hopefully. You decline to assist with this particular phase of operations and retreat back toward the common room, where the medical emergency has stabilised into something resembling controlled chaos. The head-wounded man is now conscious and complaining, which the landlady treats as positive development. If he's got the energy to argue about treatment, he's probably not dying, she announces to no one in particular. The woman with the broken arm has been given laudanum and is now floating in that peculiar space between agony and pharmaceutical relief. But even as this drama continues, the inn pivots toward its morning operations with the inexorable momentum of clockwork. Through the windows, you can see the first hints of pre-dawn grey diluting the darkness. It's approaching 5 o'clock, which means the Edinburgh stage departs in 30 minutes, and the entire establishment shifts gears to accommodate this deadline. The ostlers have already brought the fresh team to the front of the building, 4 matched horses stamping and snorting in the cold, their breath creating clouds in the lamplight. The coach itself stands ready, freshly inspected, its wheels checked, its traces examined for wear or damage. The guard is loading the boot with trunks and parcels, arranging them with Tetris-like precision to maximize capacity while maintaining weight distribution. Inside, travellers who booked seats on the 5:30 departure are descending from their rooms in various states of readiness. William the cloth merchant appears fully dressed and alert, his travelling bag packed with military efficiency. Others stumble down looking like death would be an improvement. Rumpled clothes, bloodshot eyes, the specific misery of people awakened after 3 hours of insufficient sleep. The landlady has stationed herself at a small desk near the door, ledger open, ready to settle accounts before anyone escapes without paying. Each traveller queues to pay their bills, room fees, meal charges, ale consumed, any extras charged. She checks each name against her records with the focused intensity of someone who knows exactly how easily money can vanish in morning confusion. Mr. Patterson, room 9, that's 6p for the shared bed, 5p for supper, 3p for ale, 14p total. She holds out her hand, waiting. Mr. Patterson fumbles for coins, counts them twice, receives a curt nod of acknowledgement. Next, here's your mainstream historical fact. Coaching and accounting was surprisingly sophisticated for the era, with detailed ledgers tracking individual guest charges, coach company accounts, servant wages, supplier bills, and tax obligations. The best landlords employed dedicated bookkeepers or maintained their own meticulous records, understanding that profit margins depended on capturing every transaction and minimizing theft by staff or guests. The kitchen has reached its crescendo. Breakfast is being served, not the leisurely meal that wealthy guests will receive in private parlours, but the hasty fuel consumption that travelling commoners require. Trenchers of bread, cold meat and cheese appear on the common room tables, small beer in wooden tankards, bowls of porridge for those who paid extra. Travellers grab food while simultaneously settling accounts, retrieving bags, locating fellow passengers. The Edinburgh stage passengers wear that particular expression of people trying to eat, organise belongings, and mentally prepare for another 10 hours of coach travel all at once. 5 minutes, the coach guard bellows from the doorway. 5 minutes to final boarding. Anyone not aboard in 5 minutes walks to Edinburgh. This triggers a small panic among the slower passengers. You watch a woman attempt to eat porridge, drink ale, settle her bill, and locate her missing glove simultaneously. A feat of multitasking that ends with porridge spilled on her dress and the glove discovered in her pocket where it apparently resided all along. The pompous merchant from last night descends with his bags, looking slightly less pompous after whatever sleep he managed. He tries to skip the payment queue, assuming his status grants privileges, but the landlady fixes him with a look that could freeze water. Everyone pays, Mr. Harrison, even quality. He joins the queue with poorly concealed resentment. Historians still argue whether coaching in service democratised travel by treating all paying customers similarly, or whether class distinctions simply manifested in different ways. Better rooms, better food, but everyone ultimately subject to the same schedules and payment requirements. The evidence suggests both things were true simultaneously. The accident victims from earlier remain on their tables by the fireplace, but the rest of the common room has been rapidly restored to breakfast functionality. The same space that served as emergency hospital 30 minutes ago now hosts travellers mechanically consuming bread and cheese, barely awake enough to chew. Outside, the guard is performing final checks, testing the door latches, examining the wheel hubs, ensuring the baggage is secured properly. The coachman has mounted his box seat and taken up the reins, talking quietly to his team in that particular tone experienced drivers use. Half command, half conversation. "All aboard for Edinburgh!" The guard's voice cuts through the morning chaos. "Durham, Newcastle, Berwick, and Edinburgh, departing in 2 minutes, whether you're ready or not." The final scramble begins. Passengers abandon half-eaten breakfast and rush for the door. The nervous clergyman nearly trips over his own bag. William moves with practiced calm, having done this approximately 800 times before. A young couple, honeymooners perhaps, or eloping lovers, hold hands as they board, which is adorable until you remember they're about to spend 10 hours crammed against strangers in a space designed for maximum discomfort. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some coaching companies employed professional passenger chasers, whose job was literally to run through coaching inns at departure time, locating tardy passengers, and physically dragging them to their coaches if necessary. The position paid per successful delivery, creating perverse incentives to occasionally grab the wrong person and stuff them aboard a coach to destinations they never intended to visit. You watch from the doorway as the Edinburgh stage pulls away with impressive precision, the coachman cracking his whip more for theatrical effect than necessity, the guard settling into his rear perch with the mail sack secured beneath him. The horses lean into their collars, and within seconds the coach is swallowed by the pre-dawn darkness, its lanterns disappearing north like fading stars. The inn releases a collective breath. The 5:30 departure has been accomplished on schedule despite coach accidents, medical emergencies, and the general chaos of managing 80 overnight guests. The landlord stands in the yard for a moment, watching the coach lights vanish, then turns back to his establishment with the weary satisfaction of someone who's survived another night. You're struck by a sudden realization. This exact scene is playing out simultaneously at dozens of coaching inns along this road. Right now, at this very moment, coaches are departing, arriving, or preparing at the Green Dragon in Stevenage, the White Hart in Grantham, the George at Stamford, the Angel at Doncaster. The entire Great North Road is waking up in synchronized rhythm, a 400-mile machine grinding into motion, the Great North Road. The phrase carries weight beyond simple geography. This isn't just a route from London to Edinburgh, it's the central nervous system of British commerce, politics, and communication. Every letter between Parliament and Scottish courts travels this road. Every merchant moving goods between England's capital and Scotland's industries uses these inns. Every idea, innovation, scandal or revolution that needs to travel north or south passes through establishments exactly like the Red Lion. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Great North Road was Britain's busiest coaching route throughout the 18th century, with dozens of scheduled services operating daily and hundreds of private coaches using the infrastructure. At peak times, major inns like the Red Lion might see 20 to 30 coach arrivals in a single day, each bringing fresh passengers, mail, parcels and news. The route connected over 100 coaching inns, creating an economic corridor that generated employment for thousands and moved goods and information at unprecedented speeds for the pre-railway era. You step back inside, where the landlady is already directing clean-up operations. The tables used as hospital beds are being scrubbed, the breakfast debris is being cleared, the accident victims have been moved to a quieter room where they can rest while awaiting the surgeon. Within minutes, all evidence of the morning's chaos will be erased, the common room reset for the next wave of arrivals. The cook emerges from the kitchen, flour-dusted and exhausted, to consult with the landlady about lunch provisions. We're low on mutton after last night's service. The butcher won't deliver until afternoon. Should I substitute pork or stretch what we have? Use the pork. The landlady decides. Better to serve good food than scanty portions, and make extra. We've got the Edinburgh-bound mail coach arriving at 1 o'clock, and they always travel full this time of month. Their conversation reveals the constant supply chain management required to operate a coaching inn. Food arrives from local farms and butchers on irregular schedules. Beer comes from breweries miles away. Hay and grain for horses need constant replenishment. Linens wear out and require replacement. Candles, firewood, soap, chamber pots. The list of consumables is endless, and all of it needs to flow into the inn at rates matching consumption. The Red Lion is a node in multiple overlapping networks: the coaching network, the postal network, the supply network, the information network, the financial network. Stand in this building long enough, and you'll encounter most of the social classes travelling Britain's roads. Merchants discussing trade, lawyers heading to courts, soldiers on leave, families visiting relatives, criminals fleeing justice, lovers eloping, the desperate, the ambitious, the curious, all funneled through the same narrow corridor between London and Edinburgh. Historians still argue whether the coaching inn network represented proto-capitalism at its finest or most exploitative, with evidence supporting both interpretations. The system moved goods and people with remarkable efficiency, creating opportunities for social mobility and economic growth. It also extracted maximum profit from captive audiences, paid subsistence wages to workers, and operated with minimal regulation or safety oversight. You wander toward the front windows, watching the yard gradually fill with daylight. The ostlers are already preparing for the next arrival. The southbound mail coach from Edinburgh, due in approximately 2 hours. Fresh horses are being groomed. The yard is being swept of the previous night's accumulation of straw, manure, and general debris. A new day's operations are beginning even as the previous night's events are still being processed. The Great North Road extends north from this spot through increasingly wild country, through Yorkshire's moors, across Durham's coalfields, over the Scottish border into lands that were, within living memory, foreign territory hostile to English travellers. The road was built on Roman foundations in some sections, following routes that have carried traffic for nearly 2,000 years. Each coaching inn along this route maintains its own character, while serving identical functions. Some are famous for exceptional food, others are notorious for bedbugs or surly landlords. A few have gained reputations as gathering places for particular groups. Lawyers at one, merchants at another, military officers at a third. But all of them, every single one, perform the same essential service, keeping the traffic moving. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some coaching inns along the Great North Road maintained intelligence, books, where travellers could record road conditions, interesting encounters, recommendations for other establishments, and warnings about dangers ahead. These informal guides were consulted religiously by regular travellers and occasionally provided better information than official road surveys. One inn near Durham allegedly kept such a book for 40 years before it was stolen by a traveller who recognised its value as a comprehensive guide to 18th century road travel. The sky lightens incrementally, darkness retreating to reveal a November morning that looks exactly as cold and unwelcoming as it feels. You've been awake, more or less, for approximately 4 hours, having achieved perhaps 90 minutes of actual sleep scattered across the night in fragments too brief to qualify as restful. Your spine feels like it's been realigned by an enthusiastic but incompetent chiropractor. Your eyes are gritty with exhaustion, and yet the inn expects you to continue northward today because the coaching schedule respects neither human suffering nor reasonable sleep requirements. Thomas emerges from your shared room looking somehow worse than you feel, which is almost comforting. His nightcap sits askew on his head, his eyes are red-rimmed, and he moves with the careful deliberation of someone whose body is lodging formal complaints about recent treatment. "Never again," he mutters, more to himself than you. "Next time I'm paying for the private chamber, bankruptcy be damned." The common room fills gradually with other survivors of the night, travellers in various states of disrepair, all facing the same brutal calculus. Do you continue your journey exhausted, or do you pay for another night here and risk falling further behind schedule? Most choose to continue, because stopping means additional expense, and most people are already travelling at the edge of their budgets. Breakfast service has evolved from the hasty pre-departure chaos into something slightly more civilised. You claim a spot at one of the long tables and receive your included meal, bread that's admirably fresh given that it was baked approximately 2 hours ago, a slab of cold beef that's probably yesterday's roast repurposed, and a wedge of hard cheese that could double as building material. Small beer to wash it down because water remains a dicey proposition. The bread is genuinely good. The cook's 3 a.m. labours weren't wasted. The beef is acceptable, if somewhat dry. The cheese is cheese, performing its ancient duty of being dense, salty, and theoretically nutritious. You eat mechanically, fueling your body for another day of travel rather than pursuing anything resembling culinary pleasure. Around you, other travellers conduct their own breakfast rituals. The couple who argued about the coastal route all night are still arguing, now about whether to continue together or part ways and travel separately out of spite. A merchant writes furiously in a ledger, apparently conducting business, correspondence over breakfast. The knitting woman from last night has resumed knitting, her needles clicking with metronomic rhythm while she chews bread. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Breakfast at coaching inns was included in overnight room rates specifically to ensure early departures. If travellers had to pay separately for morning meals, many would skip breakfast to save money, then feel ill during the journey and potentially delay the coaches. The included breakfast was enlightened self-interest, keeping the schedule flowing by keeping passengers minimally nourished. The accident victims from the early morning are reportedly stable. The surgeon finally arrived around 6 a.m., a small nervous man with bloodshot eyes suggesting his own interrupted sleep, and set the woman's broken arm with impressive speed and only moderate screaming. The head wounded man is being kept under observation, but appears likely to survive with nothing worse than the impressive scar, and probably a headache for the rest of his life. Your northbound coach departs at 9 o'clock, giving you roughly 2 hours to finish breakfast, settle your account, and prepare for another day of being rattled along rutted roads toward your destination. You're not looking forward to it, but then, nobody really looks forward to coach travel. You simply endure it because the alternatives are walking for weeks or not travelling at all. The landlady approaches with her ledger, ready to collect payment. You hand over your wooden token along with the 6pence for your half-bed and the 5pence from last night's supper. She marks you paid with a flourish of her quill, nods acknowledgement, and moves to her next customer. The transaction is complete, your obligation to the Red Lion fulfilled. Historians still argue whether coaching inns represented fair value for money or systematic exploitation of travellers who had no real alternatives, with evidence suggesting the answer varied dramatically by establishment, location, and individual landlord ethics. Some inns provided genuine hospitality at reasonable rates. Others were basically legalised robbery operations, charging maximum prices for minimum service. You step outside into the yard where morning activity has reached full intensity. Ostlers groom horses, mend harnesses, and shovel manure with the cheerful energy of people who've been awake since 4 a.m. and have accepted their fate. A wagon loaded with barrels is being unloaded at the kitchen entrance. Fresh ale delivery probably, replacing what was consumed last night. The Great North Road stretches before you, north toward Scotland, south toward London, a ribbon of packed earth and gravel connecting destinations you can barely imagine from this one muddy inn-yard. Last night's storm of humanity has passed through, leaving behind only memories and a few coins in the landlord's strongbox, and tonight will bring another storm, and another, in endless succession. Here's your quirky tidbit for the journey ahead. Some regular travellers along the Great North Road developed reputations at specific inns, being greeted by name, given preferred rooms, extended credit without question. These road regulars formed unofficial communities spanning hundreds of miles, connected only by their shared experiences at the same sequence of coaching establishments. Some regulars requested the same room at the same inn every trip, creating a peculiar form of itinerant home. As you stand in the yard watching the morning light strengthen, you feel the weight of the night settling into your bones, not unpleasantly, just the gentle heaviness of a body that has been awake through darkness and now welcomes the promise of eventual rest. The inn behind you is already fading into memory, becoming just another stop along an endless road, and the travellers you shared space with for one night are returning to being strangers, their stories incomplete, their destinations unknown. The coaches will keep running, north and south, carrying their cargo of humanity through seasons and years, and the Red Lion will keep opening its doors to each new wave of exhausted travellers seeking warmth, food, and those questionable beds that somehow feel like luxury after 8 hours of being rattled along rutted roads. The ostlers will keep tending their horses through the small hours of the morning. The cook will keep rising at 3 a.m. to bake bread that feeds people whose names she'll never learn, and the landlady will keep her ledger, recording transactions that blur together into one continuous stream of arrivals and departures. You think about your own bed at home, waiting however many days and miles ahead, with its familiar lumps and its clean sheets and its blessed solitude, and you promise yourself that when you finally reach it, you'll appreciate it with the fervour of someone who spent a night sharing a sagging mattress with a snoring legal clerk named Thomas. The morning is gentle now, the chaos of night fading into something softer, quieter, almost peaceful, and as you prepare to board your coach for the next leg of your journey, you find yourself feeling strangely grateful for this glimpse into the great flowing river of travellers who move endlessly along Britain's roads, each carrying their own stories, their own reasons for going somewhere else, all connected by the simple fact of being away from home and heading, eventually, toward wherever home might be. The coach door opens, you climb inside, and the Great North Road continues its ancient work of connecting lives and places across distances that once seemed impossible to cross. One rattling, uncomfortable, absolutely unforgettable journey at a time.